I'm really delighted to welcome Maria Baer from Ohio, a freelance writer and reporter who's also runs the Breakpoint podcast at the Colson Center for the Christian Worldview. And you wrote a really interesting article for us, Maria, on can women have it all in response to the Wall Street Journal article on that, and with interesting responses.
Mhm.
So do you want to first tell us who you are and why this is a topic of interest to you?
Well, sure. So thank you for that. And I'm giggling at the characterization because my boss, John Stone Street at the Colson Center, would probably be giggling as well. I don't know if I run the podcast, but I do co-host the Breakpoint This Week podcast. So I'm really delighted to be here. But most importantly, I'm also a mom. I have two young kiddos. They are 9 and 6. And so I've been navigating the world of motherhood, but also contributing some economically to my family as well, and just the challenges that attend that emotionally and logistically and all of those things. So there was this piece, as you mentioned, in the Wall Street Journal recently. And I will say, I think like most women, probably most people, am really tired of this phrase having it all. I mean, I think it's a pretty bad cliche at this point. I'm not sure that anyone actually uses it in seriousness anymore, but it is kind of a shorthand. We know what we mean when we're talking about it, which tends to be, can women have kind of a high-powered career that's on an upward trajectory while they are also raising small children? And that for a long time, kind of oddly to my estimation, has been a feminist ideal. Like we will know we're doing well from a progressive feminist standpoint if women can and are doing this. Um, I think I pointed out as you mentioned, there was a lot of feedback to this piece, and I'll get to kind of the bones of the piece in a minute. But I just pointed out afterwards, I do think it's weird that from a typically kind of, if not anti-capitalist, at least capitalism weary or wary, you know, segment of the commentariat, this is kind of a weird vision to really push into because it strikes me as extremely pro-capitalist. Because almost always in these conversations about women and work, we're talking about one very specific kind of work, and it is work for money and work that is, like I mentioned, on an upward trajectory, right? We're not ever really talking about volunteer work or like being involved
Mm.
in your community or kind of civic engagement. When we're talking about women having it all and whether we're doing well as a feminist society, we're talking about upwardly mobile, economically driven work, which just seems strange to me. But that wasn't the central idea behind this piece that I did with IFS. That was sort of a response to the entire conversation, but also this piece in the Wall Street Journal where the reporters had clearly pitched this as sort of a twist in the have it all debate, where this was like, hey, we know that, feminist and typically progressive women have been aiming for this for a long time, but here are a handful of really impressive, high powered conservative women who seem to be doing this as well. And they talked about some news contributors, women with very high up positions in the White House and the Trump administration who will also have very young families, including babies. And, the kind of the questions in the piece were like, well, what if conservative women can do this too? And is this good? And how do they do it? Which is always the perennial question. And I liked that a lot of the women they interviewed talked about how, it's because they have such a deep care for their
Mm.
family, like they're very intentional about how they've structured their lives and all of that.
Well, that's great. Well, I think that's right. I mean, the Wall Street Journal did seem to think, oh, this is very exciting. Feminism has like reached its full maturity and peak because finally
Right.
conservatives have caught up with the idea that everyone should just be a dual income household,
Right.
maxing out the GDP.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
then you obviously then pulled up, yeah, well, women may be able to have it all, although I don't think you were suggesting that they can. But
Right.
there's a very significant element left out, which is
Right.
children.
Yeah.
And so what are the children left with?
Yeah.
And so what is your thinking there as a mom?
And this in particular seemed like an issue where the single biggest stakeholder in this conversation is the children. And we never seem to ask in the same breath, how are the kids doing with this? And what do they want? And what do they need? And so I think it's pretty clear what kids need. And you and I were talking about this a little bit today before we started. It's when you're writing a piece like this and you're asking these kinds of broad questions, we're talking about a general truth, right? And so I noticed in a lot of the pushback to this piece, and this always happens with this conversation because it's understandably very tender, people object with exceptions or individual circumstances. So I want to be clear that from the outset, my goal for a piece like this is to talk about the general ideal and what kids generally need and what do we know from the research. I think nature speaks to this already, but research increasingly is pointing to it as well, which is that children, especially very, very young children, babies through age 2, 3, 4, and 5, they really need their mom. They need their mom and their dad. And, it's not they don't need their mom every second of every day to do everything that they're asking their mom to do or requesting through their crying for their mom to do, right? But generally speaking, kids will benefit from more time with their mom very early in life. I think that speaks to the very deep biological, physiological needs that children have for their mothers. For emotional reasons, certainly attachment is, we know, and we continue to find out as the research continues, how dramatically important having a secure attachment as a child is for their cognitive, behavioral, emotional, psychological development all the way into life. And I mean, attachment is one of those things where if you don't have a secure attachment early on in life, there's really no repairing that later, right? There are ways of dealing with it and improving it, and psychological help that can certainly help a lot of people, but it is such a crucial part of human development. So I think when we're having conversations about what women's and mothers' schedules should or can look like, um, it's a general rule that very early in life, kids need their moms more intensely and more often than they need anyone else, and more intensely and more often than they'll need their mom, arguably later in life. That I don't think the need for your mom changes, um, but the intensity and the frequency with which you physically need your mom nearby, it's just never going to be as intense as early on in life. And so I think that's really important when we're talking about how moms
Mm,
should think about structuring their lives when they
mm.
have flexibility, right?
I know, and it's very strange that that basic biology is something that is so, as you're saying, sensitive and explosive in terms of how people respond to it. I know that here I'm often saying how at the Institute for Family Studies we deal with big data and large trends and large surveys and
Mm-hmm.
averages. And so those things are not pastorally sensitive. Everyone always has their own unique experience of family, from
Sure.
the Adams family to the Waltons. There's a real spread of experiences, and there's always
Sure.
going to be a personal anecdote to sort of suggest that the average isn't true. But yeah,
Mm.
we're always looking at the big data. That said, though, Maria, in your experience with doing parenting and being a mom,
Mm-hmm.
have you found
Mm-hmm.
yourself isolated in your position and in your approach, or have you had fellow mums on the journey with you who are also on a similar
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's a great question. I think
stage?
personally, I mean, I don't know if this is exactly what you meant, but I think early days motherhood is pretty isolating. And that's just true for a lot of women. Being um, tethered to your baby in the way that I'm describing and the way that I think babies need is just extremely challenging. It's emotionally and physically, mentally, all of those things are very true. I have felt very fortunate. I am a part of a very deeply knitted church family. And so there are many women in my church family who are in a same or similar season of life as me who have struck a balance similar to me, whether it's doing some work from home or flexible work. Like I'm fortunate enough to be able to do this kind of freelance work where I can kind of choose my schedule and those sorts of things. But I do have a lot of peers as well, friends and neighbors who are my age and mothers of young children who have gone back to work very quickly after having children. But it does seem to be kind of the assumption is that if you're an upwardly mobile family and you have a dual income and you have children, which I'm delighted that a lot of my friends and neighbors still desire, but it still seems to be that women are going back to work and that's kind of the expectation.
Yeah, so that's yeah, it's interesting that you have found some sort of community, some solidarity at
Hmm.
church
For sure.
to do this. But yeah, I remember. What do you think in terms of then the reaction that you had to the article? What was probably like the one thing that annoyed you the most, or that you thought people aren't understanding what I am saying here?
Yeah. And I found myself, I had some really, I think, wonderful interactions with some people who felt very strongly about the piece. Most of the people who commented on it were unhappy with it. And I ended up having some great conversations, and I got to a place where I was telling a lot of other women, like, there's not a night that you go to bed as a mom and you're not running back through your day and finding something to feel guilty about. I think that's just the nature of parenting, nature of motherhood. Like the stakes are so incredibly high. You'll never love anybody like you love your children, and the sense of responsibility that you feel for them, for their development and health and safety and well-being is so intense that that's I think that's part of why parenting is a two-person job, because no one person can possibly carry that, I think, themselves, although a lot of people are thrust in that situation. But all that to say, my goal was certainly not to increase anyone's avenue or widen the avenue towards guilt for moms, but I know that that's inevitable. Anytime you talk about this, that's the button that you're pushing. That's like the wound that you're opening, and it's already there. So I know that, but that's also why I feel like it is actually the more feminist, if you want to use that term. I feel like I'm having these discussions is treating women like adults. Like, hey, I actually think you're strong enough and you're capable of asking what's best for your kids, even if I don't want to hear it. And even if it makes me feel bad, and even if it's challenging, and even if it's the not really the way I want to structure my life right now, I think you're capable of having that discussion. I think it is the anti-feminist and somewhat patronizing point of view to say this is too tender or this is too hard, and too many women don't have the option to ask these questions, so therefore we can't. I think we're strong enough to ask ourselves and each other, and then also strong enough to be confident in the decisions we make individually. But it is worth asking in the aggregate, what do kids generally want or need? So most of the feedback I got that I felt was maybe not being especially charitable to the piece was women just telling me again about their individual experiences, or women suggesting that by me saying that generally speaking, it is best for kids, very young children, to have their moms around. I had the accusation from several corners that, oh, you're saying that any type of daycare is terrible. Like that basically it makes no difference if I, send my kid to this horrible, inattentive, like borderline criminal entity down the street versus like a Montessori school where they're getting one-on-one. Like you're saying it just does not even matter that if they're not with their mom, they're just doomed. And I felt like I was pretty clear in the piece, but also anybody reading it charitably would come away with it understanding that we're talking about general rules or averages, like you said. So statistics are never destiny for an individual person. So certainly not saying that. I certainly did not also enter at all into the debate about what kind of daycare. And I certainly was not asserting that all daycare is equally bad or that kind of thing. What I was just trying to say was that we should be considering what kids need in this conversation and what they want and deserve. Um, and what we know from the data is that generally more time with their mom is better as opposed to less time when they're very young. That's really a simple claim. And most of the women who pushed back that I was able to have a conversation with, we would get to the end of our conversation and they would say like, well, of course I agree with you. Like everybody knows that, but this just made me feel or could make women feel this way. And again, I understand that, but I also think we're strong enough and adult enough to have a conversation about it.
Have you had chance in as you've thought about this issue to think about what may work policy-wise to help mothers have perhaps more choice? Because I think you said in your piece how most mums would actually prefer to have some sort of part-time
Yeah.
work.
Yes.
But have you come across anything else that may work or would suit people?
This is a really, really hard question because I hesitate even to suggest that this is like a policy problem, because I think that um, you know, whenever we have these discussions, and like you said, the data certainly shows that most moms, particularly of children, young children, but also all the way up to 18, would prefer either part-time or no work as opposed to full-time out of the house work away from their kids. And so this includes moms for whom it's not a financial possibility for them to stay home when their kids are young or growing. Um, but at the same time, I think to suggest that like the government should force companies, for example, to allow women, whatever, 6 months or 2 years. We really, early in life, we're talking about through like age 4 is where some of the stats really show is what where kids need this really involved mom. I don't think that's realistic. And I don't know that the government needs to be or should be involved in forcing companies to allow that. It also kind of, I think that reinforces this view that like your work for your company or your contributions to the economy are the most important contributions that you're making here. And so how do we facilitate that while you have this like added responsibility of your children at home? I don't necessarily like the message that sends. I'm also not a policy person at all. So I don't know what kind of impact it could or would have. When companies, I think I mentioned in the piece, it is a trend now that more and more companies are offering like in-house daycare for their employees, and they'll often tout this as like a very pro-women, pro-family policy. And it sounds good to the ear, but then it also pretty quickly can get a little creepy. Like it can have the feeling of your boss kind of almost pressuring you to come back to work. Like, look how easy we made it and we facilitated this. I don't know that there's always that malicious intent, but I think in some cases, this is going to require a bit of a shift in the way we view our lives. Similar to the way that Brad and Institute for Family Studies, Brad Wilcox, have talked about the way we look at marriage as, it used to be a cornerstone. Now we think of it as a capstone where it's like an achievement once you've achieved all these other levels of life. We might need to adjust the way we think of a successful life or our goals, economically for our family or whatever else, where, maybe like in my case, again, I feel very fortunate for a multitude of reasons, but including financially, that I don't need to work all day every day to support my family. But certainly there are vacations we haven't taken, and we don't have maybe as big of a house as I would love for us to have. And these are the sorts of calculations that you make. And I think at the end of the day, that's where we would have the most impact on this discussion, is if we kind of changed what the norms were and what our expectations were around this season of life.
So Maria Baer, thank you so much for joining us here at the Institute for Family Studies.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a privilege to kind of have this conversation with the wider world.
Thank you.